Imagine waking up to find your entire community targeted for relocation by secret international deal. Would you have a say? Or could the future of millions be decided behind closed doors? This is the high-stakes reality unfolding for Gaza's Palestinians right now.
Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is reportedly negotiating with South Sudan to resettle up to 2 million Palestinians from Gaza. A move is labeled voluntary migration, but in the chaos of ongoing war, how real is that choice?
Netanyahu calls it an opportunity for Gazans to leave, but Palestinians and nearly all human rights groups see it differently, condemning the plan as an attempt to erase a people and break international law. The risks are massive. For Palestinians, it's the potential loss of homeland. For the world, it's a precedent that could redefine forced migration. After nearly 2 years of bombardment, over 2 million people are already displaced, with neighborhoods in ruins and famine looming. Now, their fate is being discussed as part of a geopolitical bargain. South Sudan, itself fragile and recovering from conflict, is being considered as a destination, with quiet diplomatic talks about setting up refugee camps. These negotiations are happening with minimal transparency as major powers distance themselves from the fallout. If these secret deals go unchallenged, we risk missing the bigger picture, not just a humanitarian emergency, but a global test of power, law, and human rights, with millions at stake. So how did this controversial plan emerge? Who is driving it? And what might it mean for everyone watching? Let's dig into the origins of this plan, the key players involved, and why the world should care about what happens next. Suddenly, the idea of relocating Gaza's people is everywhere. But why now? And who's pushing it? If you think this is just another headline, think again. What happens next could redraw borders and set dangerous precedents for international law, with millions of lives on the line. Let's start with the harsh reality. After nearly 2 years of relentless Israeli military operations, Gaza's roughly 2,300,000 residents have been driven from their homes. More than 61,600 people are dead, and the enclave is left starving, ruined, and struggling to survive. In this context, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is now openly discussing so-called voluntary migration, a term that sounds harmless, but could become a code for forced removal. He argues that this fits with former U.S. President Donald Trump's old proposals, which floated the idea of resettling large groups of Gazans abroad as part of a new regional order. But this isn't just an isolated idea or a wild theory. Israel has reportedly approached at least 3 other nations, Somalia, Egypt, and Indonesia, about absorbing Palestinian refugees. The latest twist links Netanyahu to active talks with South Sudan, a country torn by its own wars and instability. If Gazans were sent there, it would mean transferring people from one conflict zone into another, compounding their trauma and danger. Palestinians and human rights organizations are sounding the alarm, calling these plans forced displacement disguised as choice. International law strictly forbids the mass expulsion of populations, and critics argue that real voluntary migration is impossible if people are running from bombs, hunger, and devastation, not moving freely by choice. Still, Israeli officials keep talking about opportunities to leave, and even temporary camps, risking the normalization of a policy that could break legal and humanitarian norms worldwide. If such moves are accepted, it could pave the way for future forced transfers elsewhere, endangering rights far beyond Gaza. Failing to understand the full picture, the destruction on the ground, the legal boundaries, and the history of similar proposals could mean accepting these population transfer schemes at face value. That would erase the scale of the current crisis and ignore Palestinians' right to remain on their own land. So what's really happening here? Is this about genuine voluntary migration, or is there a deeper, more troubling agenda behind these diplomatic maneuvers? To answer that, we have to trace the origins of these proposals and the political motivations driving them. Let's break down how the idea evolved from fringe suggestion to front-page story.
Is so-called voluntary migration really a choice, or is it a last resort forced by devastation? If the answer is wrong, millions risk losing their homes, their rights, and perhaps the foundations of international law itself.
As Israeli forces press deeper into Gaza, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's intentions have become unmistakable. He wants Palestinians to have what he calls the opportunity to leave. In his own words, the right thing to do is to allow the population to leave, and then you go in with all your might against the enemy. Yet critics say this is no opportunity. It's an ultimatum, issued while war tears apart lives and leaves almost no room for real decisions.
Netanyahu's government is in active talks with South Sudan, seeking to send Palestinians from Gaza under the banner of voluntary migration. Similar outreach has occurred with Egypt, Somalia, and even remote countries such as Indonesia. On paper, these discussions suggest open doors, but the reality is a maze of pressure. These negotiations are anything but neutral, unfolding as more than 2 million people in Gaza face acute hunger, mass displacement, and relentless bombardment. To most Palestinians and global rights organizations, this process is not voluntary at all. They see it as forced population transfer, something international law largely forbids. The legal battle is intense. Can people truly choose to leave when their homes lie in ruins? Or is the language of voluntary just a thin veil for coercion? Other nations' interests make the situation even murkier. For South Sudan, accepting Palestinians could mean new alliances, aid, or leverage with Israel. For Israel, moving Palestinians out could clear the way for a decisive military operation. Meanwhile, for major powers like the United States, the stance has shifted. Although the Trump administration once floated the idea of relocating large numbers of Palestinians, international outrage quickly made them back off, at least publicly. Still, diplomatic maneuvering continues beneath the surface. If these migration plans go ahead, the impacts could be monumental, not only for Palestinians, but for the global rules that govern conflict, refugees, and the rights of nations. The very notion of voluntary migration here is entangled in power games, legal ambiguity, and the lived trauma of people trapped between war and exile. So what are the ripple effects if this unprecedented push for relocation succeeds or fails? The answers reach far beyond Gaza, reshaping norms, alliances, and the fate of millions. Let's break down what makes this plan so controversial and why it's capturing the world's attention. The next chapter reveals the mechanics, motivations, and global stakes behind this high-risk gamble. What would a mass transfer of Palestinians from Gaza to South Sudan actually look like, and who stands to gain or lose? Vast humanitarian transit areas, essentially sprawling camps, built either inside Gaza or across the border in South Sudan. This is not speculation. Israeli officials, together with the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, have already submitted a plan worth more than $2 billion, with outlines for temporary camps where Palestinians would de-radicalize, reintegrate, and prepare to relocate if they wish. But the reality behind these sanitized phrases is anything but temporary or voluntary. South Sudan, the proposed destination, is itself war-torn and deeply unstable. Its own citizens have grappled with years of civil conflict, displacement, and food insecurity. To move hundreds of thousands or even millions of traumatized Palestinians to such a fragile state risks triggering new humanitarian disasters. For Palestinians, the stakes are existential. Forced from their homeland, separated from families, and thrust into an uncertain future, they would lose not just their homes, but their history and rights. International law is clear. Forced population transfers are considered a crime, and human rights groups have condemned the plan as an act of ethnic cleansing. The echoes of past forced migrations and the backlash they unleashed hang heavy over these proposals. Regionally, the ripple effects could be explosive. Neighboring Egypt, for instance, has already rejected similar resettlement proposals, fearing unrest and demographic upheaval. In South Sudan, the arrival of a large, desperate refugee population could destabilize a weak government and inflame existing tensions. Globally, the diplomatic fallout is building. European countries have issued sharp condemnations, and Germany has already paused arms sales to Israel in protest. Such moves isolate Israel further, erode trust in international negotiation, and threaten to undermine the global system meant to precisely this kind of forced displacement. And while some in Israel's government or certain Western circles might hope such a transfer could solve the Gaza question or redraw the region's power map, the risks for the Palestinian people, for South Sudan, and for regional stability are immense. Poorly understood or executed, this could fuel new cycles of violence, deepen humanitarian catastrophe, and deal a lasting blow to the credibility of international law. But what, if anything, can ordinary people or policy watchers actually do in the face of such a sprawling crisis? So how can citizens and global observers move beyond outrage, and what lessons can be drawn from this moment of high-stakes diplomacy? When high-stakes population transfers are on the table, what's the real power of global attention, and what tools exist to hold leaders accountable? Let's get practical. First, global rejection matters. Palestinians themselves, along with leading human rights groups, have overwhelmingly rejected Israel's proposal to relocate Gaza's people, even as some leaders frame it as voluntary migration. Their voices, public statements, and the legal outcry shape the narrative, putting pressure on governments and international bodies not to legitimize forced displacement. We've seen before that international pressure can work. Across history, state actions, from apartheid to ethnic expulsions, have been slowed, rerouted, or even reversed when mass protest, media coverage, and diplomatic isolation reached a tipping point. For example, the global movement against South African apartheid directly influenced policy shifts. Sanctions, travel bans, and coordinated international statements have changed leaders' calculations in other crises too. But attention is not action. Policymakers and activists can push for more, demanding investigations, supporting independent reporting, and refusing to recognize land or population changes that violate international law. Lobbying for targeted sanctions or legal proceedings also raises the cost of unilateral actions, showing that there are consequences beyond diplomatic statements alone.
Ordinary people have tools as well. Platforms for raising awareness, from social media campaigns to international petitions, help keep stories in the spotlight and sustain pressure. Humanitarian organizations have shown their impact too. For instance, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation coordinated the delivery of more than 52 million meals to people in Gaza over just 5 weeks, filling urgent gaps that governments left open.
If these levers go unused, outcomes are shaped only by the most powerful actors at the table, not by those most affected. The risk is that silence or inaction becomes complicity, turning global crises into mere bargaining chips in the hands of a few. So, what does all this urgency add up to? It forces us to ask who is really accountable, and what options remain as the situation evolves. The path ahead is complex, and every decision now will set precedents for the future. Next up, we'll confront the unresolved questions and responsibilities facing the world community.
Right now, you are witnessing more than a news story. This is a live stress test for the limits of international law and basic humanity. If we look away, the rules of war and the value of human rights could shift forever.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's push to allow Palestinians to leave Gaza, possibly to South Sudan, is not just about headlines. It is a high-stakes experiment in 21st century geopolitics, unfolding as Israel's offensive has displaced nearly the entire population, over 2 million people. Netanyahu's plan for so-called voluntary migration is now the lightning rod at the center of a global debate. Palestinians and human rights groups have condemned any forced removal from their homeland, warning the world of a line that must not cross. International law forbids mass relocation under duress, yet secret negotiations between Israel and South Sudan keep moving forward, with similar conversations reportedly reaching Egypt and Indonesia. Who gains and who loses? Israel could secure more leverage. South Sudan might gain powerful allies. But for ordinary Palestinians, robbed of control, facing the threat of exile, the cost is everything. Every decision now will echo far beyond Gaza, rewriting the rules for future conflicts. Our reaction matters. Staying silent risks turning humanitarian disasters into political tools. By engaging, questioning, and demanding accountability, we help decide whether humanity or realpolitik wins when the stakes are highest. So the real question is not only what happens next in Gaza, but what kind of world we shape through our attention, our words, and our actions. In the next chapter, we break down the historical roots that set the stage for this crisis. Understanding the past is key to making sense of the stakes today.